Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about classics. So, classics are one of those genres that are kind of, I feel like, really hit or miss. Personally, most of the time I love classics. Typically a classic by default is a book that's, I would say, at least 50 plus years old. Because a classic to me, it could be any genre. It could be like historical fiction, horror, sci-fi, romance, whatever, you name it. But then because it becomes a classic if it is relevant at the time of its publication, and then its relevance kind of transcends through time. So like, if I read it today, if I read like a 200-year-old book today and its message, theme, idea, whatever are still relevant today, then it's a classic. Even though what I just said is still true, okay, like I still feel like classics will stay true to every time period. I feel like one thing that does keep people from reading classics, at least from, the people I've spoken to in my life about this, is that reading a classic and enjoying it to its full potential kind of comes with a lot of ifs and buts. One book I'm going to mention in a sec is Animal Farm by George Orwell. I'm going to just use that one as a quick example, right? So if you read Animal Farm, it's a cool book about animals on a farm that take over or kick out the humans and rebuild their own society. Cool. And if you have zero context on the book, it's still a really good book. But I feel like what gives a classic a whole, like, or actually any book, what gives a book its whole dimension is its historical context. For example, with Animal Farm, it was written about Soviet leaders, and every animal is representing a Soviet leader. And so knowing that, and knowing that Animal Farm is actually a giant critique of the leadership during the Bolshevik era, in the late middle to post-World War I era, then I feel like just knowing that gives the book a whole nother dimension, which is the same for a lot of classics. And I feel like a lot of books depend on that a little too much. You know what I mean? So that's just my 2 cents on maybe why people don't read classics as much. I don't know. Anyway, so I put together a little recommendations list for you guys here. So like my French classics recommendation video, which I'll link in the cards and down below, I'm going to have 4 books for each category, going from beginner to intermediate and then advanced. And then I have a little bonus category at the end with 2 books that I think you should read together. So stay tuned to figure out which ones and why. So for the beginner section here, my first recommendation, as I mentioned earlier, is Animal Farm by George Orwell. For the reasons I mentioned earlier. Now, I think this one is a very easy read. Like I said 2 seconds ago, it's a very, you don't need a lot of context to enjoy the story. Even if you don't know the historical context, it's still really good. And you know what? It's fine because I just gave you the historical context. So there you go. Book number 2 is As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams by Lady Sarashina. So, Animal Farm, by the way, is more historical fiction. As I Crossed the Bridge of Dreams is nonfiction. It's an account of an 11th century Japanese woman who is traveling from one city to the other, and she's just writing her journey. When I was reading it, it really took me back. In my head, I was just I could see the landscape. I had, those old Japanese paintings in my head, and I could really feel it. I really felt like I was there. And there was such an element of wonder that, and I'm not familiar with Japan too much, but this book really took me back. It was such an amazing experience. And it's still a really easy read. I mean, there's nothing too complicated about it. I feel like it's just one of those sit backs and enjoy something you don't know about the 11th century kind of a thing. Awesome. Totally check it out. My next recommendation is going to be Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So this one is a horror novel about Dr. Frankenstein. I feel like everyone knows the story, but everyone makes the mistake. Frankenstein is the doctor, not the monster. Thank you very much. So it's about Dr. Frankenstein who creates a monster with various body parts, and he gives him life, essentially. And I'm not saying anything else because I feel like it's a little spoilery, even though it's such a classic that I feel like everyone kind of knows what it's about, but whatever. I thought Frankenstein was a really easy read, first of all. If you like horror, then totally pick it up. It was very well written. The flow of events was really well constructed. And may I also recommend Frankenstein, the original movie, and The Bride of Frankenstein original movie. Those two are really good, but that's beside the point. Anyway, and then my last recommendation for the beginner section is the Arabian Nights. And the author is anonymous, or unknown, I want to say, not anonymous, unknown. So, the Arabian Nights are a collection of short stories, but basically the story is that one time a sultan was cheated on by his wife, and so he completely distrusted women forever and ever, but he still needed a wife, you know. So what he would do is he would pick a woman from the town, and he would marry her in the evening, and then he would do his nightly duties with his wife, and then kill her in the morning. That way he would never get cheated on ever again. So the story goes that he married every single woman in the town, and he would always marry her in the evening and kill her in the morning. And so eventually they were running out of women. And so one day, one girl volunteered to be his wife. Her name was Scheherazade. So the Sultan asked his wife to entertain him in the evening, and so what she did is that she started telling him a story. But by morning time, the story wasn't over. So the Sultan said, you know what, I really like this story. I'm going to let you live, and then you can tell me the story, and then I'll kill you tomorrow. So every night Scheherazade would finish the previous night's story and start a new one, and the Sultan was, every night, he was like, wow, I really want to know the next story. I'll kill you tomorrow. So after 1001 stories, by the way, the alternative title is The Arabian Nights or 1001 Tales. So basically, because after 1001 Tales, Scheherazade was like, okay, that's my last story. You're gonna kill me tomorrow. And the Sultan said, no, I've really grown to like you or love you, whatever. And so he decided to let her live. And so that's the Arabian Night Tales. The tales are the 1001 stories, but they're really awesome because they're short stories, and they are, I've read some of them, not all of them, but they are very whimsical and totally awesome. And I feel like as a kid, they're great reads. As an adult also, so. Alright, so moving into our intermediate section, my first recommendation here is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Now, the book is a little bit long, so it may seem a little bit daunting, but I find that Charles Dickens' writing is actually very easy to read. It's the story of Pip, whose parents both died, so he's raised by his sister and her husband in a very poor environment, and he is essentially given a inheritance, and he grows up in a very wealthy environment, and then that's all I can say without giving any spoilers, basically. But it's a coming-of-age story, essentially, and it's very well written. One thing that's very easy to read about Charles Dickens' story, I don't know about his other books, but this is how he published Great Expectations. At the time, middle-class people couldn't afford to buy books, let alone one as long as Great Expectations. I think it's like 300, maybe 400 pages long, something like that. But he would publish one chapter in the newspaper per week. And so what that does is that every chapter had to be like a mini, like, I don't want to say like a mini story, but it had to have some type of beginning and some type of a hook at the end to make people want to buy the newspaper next week and keep reading. You know what I mean? So it's not like when a book is published in its entirety, where when you finish one chapter, the next one's on the next page anyway, so the chapters don't have to make you want to keep reading in the same way. Does that make sense? Yes, totally check out Great Expectations. It's a really fun story, and to be honest, I do find it to be a pretty modern story as well. My next recommendation is Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Now, this one is a really weird book. It is told from the perspective of a man who was a soldier during World War II, and he is kind of losing his mind. And so that is the story. It's his kind of mind that's losing it, basically. He's losing his bananas. It's a very weird story. It's pretty crude, so beware, I guess. But I do think it's a really cool read. I would say it's like psychological thriller, maybe psychological horror, one of the two, alongside with historical fiction, because it is, you know, a World War II soldier, so he does make allusions to World War II events. It's more horror than historical fiction. Do you get my, do you get my drift? Okay. Alright, so my next recommendation is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. So The Color Purple is a series of letters written by Shelley, the main character, and she writes letters to her long-lost sister, talking about her life, how she became a slave, their family history, her process of finding freedom and love, and it's just a really amazing book. It's it's very moving. I loved it. And my last recommendation for the intermediate is a little bit different. This one is letters or works by Pliny the Younger. Now, why would I recommend this? First of all, so if you didn't know, Pliny the Younger was actually a professor. He taught students how to write. So if you're a writer, definitely read his letters, because a lot of them are letters to his students, giving them advice on how to write. The reason I read some of his letters is because I really love everything that has to do with Pompeii and its eruption and everything that happened. And fun fact, Pliny the Younger was there, not in Pompeii, but he was in a city that overlooked Pompeii from the other side of the sea. And so he basically watched Pompeii happen, and a couple of his letters are basically him describing what he saw, which is awesome, awesome, awesome. I loved them. It was really cool to see like a real life account of someone who was there. And I also read some of his letters to his students, and I thought they were awesome, awesome advice. And they're just fun to read. I mean, like, when do you get to read letters from people to people from 2,000 plus years ago? All right, moving on to our advanced section. Now, quick disclaimer for my first recommendation, I actually have not read this one yet. I'm recommending it because it's like a classic, classic, classic. So, what am I saying here? I'm gonna be recommending Don Quixote, or Don Quixote? I have no idea how to pronounce it in English. Anyway, by Miguel de Cervantes, and the reason I'm recommending it, even though I haven't read it, is because, did you know, Don Quixote is the first novel to have ever been written? Yes, I believe in the 1500s or 1600s. That's a large gap. Anyway, so recommend. Alright, my next recommendation is going to be either Twelfth Night or A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. So this I'm recommending these two plays because those, of all plays I've read, I haven't read all of his plays, but those were two of my favorite ones. The reason why is because I personally felt like those two plays had a little bit more of a fairy tale-ish, whimsical, magical elements to them than some of his other plays, you know? Both stories are pretty classic Shakespearean, like, love triangle situations. But actually, A Midsummer Night's Dream, I think, is a little more fairy tale-ish than Twelfth Night. But, yes, totally recommend. And the reason I put it in advanced is because the plot is not necessarily complicated. Like, it's a love triangle. It's pretty, you know, pretty easy to understand. But it's Old English, so, you know, take it or leave it. If you're adventurous, go for it. Maybe if you want to read it, you might be able to find a modern English adaptation of it. But if you want to read the original, keep in mind it is Old English, so my next recommendation is going to be, it's in advanced for the same reason as Shakespeare was. This one is going to be The Game of Love and Chance by Pierre Marivaux. So he, it's the same thing actually. It's like a love triangle situation. This is a French play. It's very well written, but again, it's Old French, so I think it might be easier to find a newer translation because I feel like when they translate it from Old French to English, they might directly adapt it to modern English. But I did really like it. It feels honestly kind of like a Desperate Housewives episode, but old French, you know, version. The other reason I think, or the other things to keep in mind, I think, is also because this is like 1700s France, maybe customs were different too. So, like, also keeping that in mind is, and my last recommendation is going to be essays, or like collection of essays by Saint Augustine or Augustine of Hippo. So the book I read from Augustine of Hippo was a collection of essays on his ideas and thoughts on the creation of time and the creation of being. Now, I will say, I don't think it's him, maybe it's just the person who put together the selection of essays. I really liked his essays on the creation of time. I thought they were incredibly thoughtful, insightful, nuanced. Always important to have nuance within your ideas to kind of explore different, like, to be like, I think this, but actually, and I think this, and I go, and then, oh, maybe if I think about that, I like the ones about the creation of time, not so much the ones about creation of being. It's probably just the selection from the person who put together the book that I had. That being said, definitely check out his ideas on the creation of time. Those were awesome. And again, it's a little bit advanced. This is more of a classic that requires you to put some thought into it, and you can't just read it and enjoy it for what it is. Anyway, so those are my recommendations for the advanced section, and now let's go into my bonus round. So for my bonus round, I'm going to recommend that you read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley and 1984 by George Orwell. So both of these books are sci-fi, kind of speculative fiction, where speculative fiction, if you didn't know, is like where you imagine a world if something had happened, then how would the world be, right? So 1984 by George Orwell depicts a society that lives with a totalitarian regime. And then Brave New World describes a world where the government is in charge of everything, basically, and they own everything. And it's kind of like, they're both polar opposites, right? Like 1984 is totalitarian regime. Like, it was written in, I believe, 1948. So, actually, that book was written as kind of like a warning because there was like impending Cold War. And Brave New World is more of like if the world was taken over by like an extreme version of communism. So they're both kind of like polar opposites, which is why I think they're really cool to read together and compare together. Speaking of which, I just want to throw in some little thoughts here and there. I feel like what's really cool is when you read several books from different time periods and then you kind of compare them and see like how the ideas developed, maybe to books like Brave New World in 1984 where ideas conflict. How, does it work? So yeah, so those were my recommendations for classics. I hope you enjoyed them. Let me know in the comments down below if you read any of them, if you plan on reading any of them. Let me know down below if you do this thing too when you read a book and you're like, oh my god, this reminds me of XYZ. I think it's fun. Anyway, like this video if you did, comment down below, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!